So before I get going, I will preempt any questions in the comments about why I've got this mark on my forehead, because a couple of days ago I had a fall whilst, ironically, running back from the gym, trying to keep myself fit. And why did I fall? Well, because I was too preoccupied trying to work out how to express the ideas in this chapter. So I'm all right, just a bit bruised and battered, but otherwise I'm fine. And the ideas are clearer. So here we go. I want to talk about the origin of everything. And it's very much a continuation of what I explored in the last chapter. So if there's one thing we've really learned from physics, it seems to me, it's that if we want to understand the really foundational levels of reality, we need to think in unexpected and somewhat strange ways. But if we can do that, we can begin to get some sort of insight. And as with everything I'm doing in this pod book, and especially in this chapter, what I'm doing is trying to create an overall philosophy, which is just the beginnings of a way of seeing things that is built around the fundamental premise that existence is a process of becoming in which everything that has any form is forming. So what's the ontological origin then? If there's no creator, if there's no big mind at the beginning, what is the origin of this process of becoming, this realization of ever more emergent possibilities, where realization just simply means making real? That's what I mean by it. Well, I want to suggest that if you trace it back, then the simplest becoming is the one becoming two, if we use mathematical terms. Or you could say the formless forming into the primal information, the bit, this or that. So that process of the most fundamental differentiation is what I want to describe as the ontological origin of everything. So it's not a thing that we start with, it's a process, because everything is process. It's the process of the formless forming into a primal relationship, the one coming into relationship with itself. This is all ways of saying exactly the same thing, and I hope one of them may ring for you and you go, oh, I see what Tim's saying, and that will enable you then to think about it, see what we make of it. Now, the natural thing that arises, the question that comes up, is, okay, but what's the first cause? One of the roles that God plays is the first cause that starts everything going, the causeless cause. Doesn't answer anything, of course. I've been through that too many times to repeat it, but it doesn't. But in this view that I'm exploring, what's the first cause? Well, to answer that, I want to talk again about anachronistic ideas which have come up throughout this pod book. It's the idea that we take ways of conceiving things, of categorizing things, which are appropriate to a high level of emergence, and apply them to a low level of emergence where they just don't make any sense. So I've said in the last chapter, look, space and time look like they're emergent properties, and physicists are exploring that right now. So that I talked about the idea of the spatial material level as being compared to, not literally, just compared to a hologram where information can represent something which is three-dimensional, but the information's not three-dimensional. And with time also, that there are atemporal or emergently prior levels of reality which will then become what we can understand as time. And we'll have whole chapters exploring this later. One of the things which is just worth popping into your mind when you think about time, for instance, is I said in the last chapter, look, light is not information in anything. Sound is information in air, but light's just information. And one of the fascinating things about light, and you need a physicist to explain this to you, I'm not going to do that, I'm just going to drop in the information, which is, as you probably know, when you look at the stars, it's taking millions and millions of years for the photons of light to reach you from when they're being emitted to when they hit your eye. But for the photon, no time passes. Like I said, we've understood from physics, we need to think in very unexpected and strange ways. But what you're seeing there is something which is temporal and something which is not. So, my point here is, look, space and time look like they're emergent qualities. When we're looking at the ontological basement, the thing that we study with mathematics and geometry, it's not spatial, doesn't exist anywhere. It's not temporal. You can't say, how long does it take for a square to become a cube? It's not like that. These things, that just makes no sense. So if someone were to say, I'm going to give you a fun example, just because you can, in extremis you can see. If someone says to me, okay, Tim, I hear what you're saying, but the question I want to ask you is, does the number 4 like chocolate? To which I, of course, would go, well, you just can't ask that question. Asking chocolate is not an appropriate question for the number 4. And if someone were then to reply, oh, I see, so you're avoiding the question. You don't have an answer for this. You just don't know. Well, why can't you say that? It's like, well, it's not that I don't know. It's just that the question, does the number 4 like chocolate? It just doesn't make any sense. So I think it's like that when we come to understand the ontological origin. So when I say the formless is forming, coming into relationship with itself, the primal differentiation, all those things which I've tried to use words to point towards something, that primal becoming, it makes no sense to say, where did that happen? Because it didn't happen anywhere. It makes no sense to say, why did that happen? Because there was no intentionality. That's not going to come for billions of years. It makes no sense to say, when did it happen? Because this is before, emergently before, time. It is atemporal, non-temporal. And it also makes no sense to say what caused it to happen. Because causation is the effect of one system on another. Well, that's not appropriate yet. That's going to arise with time and then with space. Right now, we can't talk about causation. You can't say what caused the square to become a cube. It's just the wrong... It's as crazy as asking, does 4 like chocolate? And when you see that, you realize, oh, the reason we can't answer a lot of these big questions about the origin of things is not because we're stupid or because we haven't got there yet. It's because the questions themselves just don't make any sense. So of course we can't answer them. So at this level, what can we do? Well, I think we can look for the best description of this primal ontological reality as best we can. And what I'm sharing with you is the best I found. Maybe someone else can say something which is better. Maybe I'll find something better later. But right now, this simple, it's the formless forming into relationship with itself through differentiation, yin and yang. That's what this is. And then what's going to come from that is the whole ontological basement of information that we study with mathematics. And then from that, time and space and matter and psyche and everything. Now, I'm aware that someone could say to me, well, so this is just your premise, Tim. This is you're just assuming this. So you're just asking for blind faith that this is the way it is because you're asserting it. And what's the difference then between someone who just goes, well, look, my premise is that there's a creator God and everything flows from that. Why not just assume that instead? Or another person may go, yeah, well, I assume that there's the presence of pure consciousness that is conscious of itself and that the universe will manifest from this consciousness, all the ideas that people have. And isn't what I'm saying the same? And I don't think it is. I don't think it is the same because what I think we're looking for this description of the ontological origin is the most plausible way. And partly that is the most economical way. There's a thing called Occam's razor, which is a philosophical technique named after a gentleman called Occam, which is, if you've got two options, go for the simplest. Now, it doesn't mean the simplest is right, but there's less chance you're wrong the simpler it is, because you're saying less. So economy is a really good principle, I think, in looking for plausibility. So my claim would be it's not the same, because it is the most economical I can find. And it is, you can see it now. Now, of course, we've already explored that your ideas shape what you see, so that's not a proof. But you ought to be able to explain this. So have a look. And it seems to me there is something that unites everything, and let's call it being, and that it's one. And it's differentiated as everything. So that being, which is itself formless, it has no particular, you can't find the quality, it's just the beingness of everything, coming into the very first piece of information, relationship, duality or polarity, whichever you prefer, does seem to be born out from this process of becoming that we're witnessing all the time. All right, so there's one other really important thing I want to explore in this chapter, which is that if we want to understand the ontological basement, if we want to understand that level of the informational level of reality, which I'm suggesting starts the ontological origin of the one becoming two, whichever way you want to put that into language, there is a yin-yang quality to it, let me say. The information can come with two types of relationship, and the ontological basement, it seems to me, arising from that basic two-ness, that polarity, has both qualities. And there's various ways you could describe that. One is information which has fixed relationships, and then information that has random relationships. In philosophy, the words that get used often are necessary, they have to be that way, and contingent. They don't have to be that way. There could be other ways. And I like to use the old Greek words for this, and when I think about it, you don't worry about it if you find them a bit odd, and because they have a resonance for me, and those are logos and chaos. That there are many people who've explored the idea that there's a logos, which is the idea of fixed structures that will create the order of the universe. And then there's the idea that also at the ground often there's a chaos, which is ordered by the logos. Now, I think there's something in all of that we can explore in understanding the ontological basement. So if you look at the relationships we study in mathematics, they are necessary or fixed. If you know what the words mean, you know what the words, you could use different words, speak different languages, we could use different symbols, of course. But if you understand what 3 is, and you understand what 4 is, then you understand that 3 and 4 is 7. There's no other answer to that. If you understand what numbers are, you know that certain numbers are prime numbers, for instance. The relationships are fixed. They're necessary. It's just the way it is. And it helps to try and imagine these things. So, in my mind, I picture that like an architectural structure, which is why in the last chapter I talked about it as the architecture, the architectural plan, maybe, of the universe. The fixed structures which will come up again and again in the universe. Is it like an architectural structure? Of course not. Of course not. This is a level before space, before 3 dimensions. It's informational. But, it helps me. It may help you. And then on the other hand, we have chaos, which is random information which is arising in a completely unstructured way. And you can think about that in the simplest form as 1 and 0. just like randomly changing, or throwing a dice. Which is it going to be? And how do I imagine that? Well, the image that helps me is the image of the quantum vacuum fluctuations, sometimes called the quantum foam. And this is an amazing discovery by modern physics, absolutely mind-blowing, which is that you have empty space, which everything seems to be in right now, but it's not empty, actually. That we now know that what's happening in empty space is it's effervescent with virtual particles coming into and out of existence, creating this random exist, not exist, like the ones and zeros, bang, 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 arising, disappearing. And we can measure them. It's like it's happening. Isn't that fascinating? So that gives an image of the formless being chaotic for me. And is it like that? No, of course not. What we're looking at with the quantum foam is it coming into space? It's temporal. This is all before space and time. It's informational, but it kind of helps. So you've got the logos, these structured relationships, and the chaos, these unstructured relationships. And what I want to suggest is that the relationship between those two is going to create the becoming. That they will give rise to the universe. Interestingly, people like Stephen Hawking have speculated that the virtual particles that don't just disappear may give rise to universes, and that could be one way of understanding how universes form. Well, I don't know about that. I'm not a physicist. It's an interesting idea. He talks about baby universes, but what I want to suggest is that the information which is arising chaotically is being ordered by the logos. And the relationship between those two, logos and chaos, is what's going to create passivity and creativity. Now, I've said, look, we live in a probabilistic universe, and we'll explore more of that when we look at quantum physics, which really shows that, I think. But let's think about probability for a moment, because that's really interesting. So probability theory is looking at the fixed necessary relationships. It's fixed. If you've got two possibilities, it's 50-50. That's exactly what it is. If you've got a dice, which I mentioned earlier, you throw it, it's got, there's 6 possibilities. It's 1 in 6 that number will come up. But which number will come up, actually, when you throw it, of course, is random, but within probability. And what I'm suggesting is something along the lines of this, that as patterns develop in the chaos, patterns become ordered or arise, that the whole system then means that the probability of that pattern recurring increases. And if it carries on increasing, the probability becomes stronger. And yet it's always creative. Why? Because it's also random. There's also always, still now, there's a random level, a chaos level, just like there's a fixed level at the ontological foundation of the universe, which means that there's an interplay then between the order repeating and the chaos keeping it creative. And then the chaos becomes conditioned as well into real creativity, like where I think when I or you think of a new idea or say, that creativity is arising structured by all the levels in between, particularly the psyche, to create something new. So what I'm suggesting here is that the two forms of the yin and yang of the ontological basement, the logos and the chaos, are going to give rise to the passivity and creativity that I have been suggesting is how everything emerges. And then the other element I talk about is sustainability, that any system needs to sustain itself in relationship to everything else. And we see that throughout the evolution of everything. And it's right there, right from this beginning, which is if a system forms and it repeats and then it doesn't, If the randomness means that it doesn't, then it goes back to chaos. And so you can see that relationship of sustainability, and that's still here right now. You know, when my body dies, this vast complex of biological information will start returning to chaos. It will come back to its lesser components, and then some of those will come to their lesser components, and it starts heading back into chaos. One of the fascinating aspects of the universe, which we'll probably have a whole chapter on, is entropy, which is the tendency for energy to come into the most chaotic state from very organized states, which we use to do things with, to dissipate into chaos. So this sustainability collapsing into chaos is very much part of the universe still. Okay, I think those are the big ideas I wanted to share. So let's have a quick look at them. Well, first of all, that what I'm sharing is just the start of a philosophical view. But the simplicity of it really attracts me, which is why I've shared it with you. I've been claiming that existence is the process of becoming. Being is becoming. And that's the realization of ever more emergent possibilities. And that the ontological origin is the simplest emergent. And that is before space, emergently before, because it's also before time. It's non-temporal, non-causal, certainly no intentions. And that from that simplest of realizations, the formless coming into relationship, or the formless forming. And you know, there's a real precedent for this in the spiritual traditions, which is worth just noting. A key idea in Buddhism is that everything's empty, it's formless, and the nature of being is formless. And yet it's formed into everything. And the Mahayana tradition came up with this great, hugely important statement, which is nirvana is samsara, samsara is nirvana, which means emptiness, formlessness, is form. For me, I want to make it a process, so forming. The formless is forming, forming is formless. There you've got the fundamental idea, right there in Buddhism. And then in Taoism, you've got the idea of arising as yin and yang, a fundamental polarity. Not just in Taoism, but that's a really good one that most people know. So what I'm saying is very congruent with this. I'm going, look, the ontological basement is the formless forming. The very simplest form of forming is yin and yang. So the movement between the one and the two is the ontological origin. That's as simple as we can get. And we can't answer a whole load of questions we want to ask because they don't make any sense. And of course we want to ask them because we've come from, historically, mythological understandings where we do ask those questions, because mythological understandings are anachronistic. They take language from the human level and apply it to the lower level. It's only since science that we've understood that that's not a good idea. That's not the best way to understand things. But rather we need to think in ways which are appropriate to this level. And this level that I've been exploring in this chapter and the one before is the ontological basement, the foundation of things, which is purely informational. And that information will include the two types of relationship that information can have, which is structured and fixed, necessary, or random and contingent. And I've used the old Greek terms logos and chaos. Logos first used by Heraclitus, who is a great pioneer, I think, of this view that I'm playing with, of everything being change, to mean the structures that will, the fundamental structures that will structure everything, and then the chaos, the opposite but complementary, I think, idea that there's a randomness, an unstructuredness at the bottom of things. And I think they're both right. And it's the relationship between the two which is going to create this, the passivity and the creativity to create this. All right, so look, one more little thing, but this is not so strange now. This is just an observation which I like and which may interest you, which is about the whole theory I've been exploring, the whole philosophy generally. What strikes me is that I have been born into an age of eclecticism. When I was young, for the first time in history, I could go to my bookshop and buy or order The Wisdom of the World. Now I'm an old man, I can get it all on my phone within seconds. It's amazing what's happened. And so perhaps it's not surprising that I, and of course many others, have taken an eclectic view of things, which is bringing things together from different ways of understanding. And having written books on all of these spiritual traditions, when I look at what I've been sharing with you throughout the whole of this pod book, it looks to me like, oh, I've taken things that seem of value from all of these different places and brought them together in a way that I think makes them congruent when initially they don't seem like they are. So whereas with the perennial philosophy idea that I used to be enamored with is the idea that everyone's saying basically the same thing, and that's what makes it plausible, I don't think that is true now. What I think is true is everyone's got insights which are valuable. They're sensing the universe, and they've come up with things which we should take seriously. It's just we need to keep it evolving, and we can take these different elements and begin to see that the thing which they're seeing fits together into an overall story. So, as I've already said, I think you can go back to the Buddhist insight about formlessness and form at the start of the story I'm telling, or the Taoist view that there is a fundamental polarity, yin and yang. The Taoist view there. And then we move into science. We move from that Eastern view to science, where there's physics and biology, psychology. But where that leads in the philosophical story I want to share with you is to a realm that actually draws on the ancient insights of shamanism and esoteric traditions always of every type throughout history, which is that there is a realm, that the psyche is not just a little bubble around your head, it's a whole realm, it's a whole ecosystem. And that's where we can understand the nature of death, and it's where we can understand the nature of magic and how life becomes dreamlike because it impacts on the other levels. And finally, that leads to the idea that there is a God. It's just we misunderstood it, and that it's a super system. It's a great us. It's a place where there's a communion of souls. And in that way, it leads to something from the theistic traditions, such as Christianity. So you can see that the overall picture I want to create, it starts with Buddhism or Taoism, those ideas, goes through science and ends up with shamanism and then Christianity or any form of theism. And there's something deeply satisfying to me about that. And what I've hoped to do, and what I'll continue to do as I explore things deeper and deeper in this pod book, is to attempt to show why I think it's plausible that they all fit together in an emergent story of evolution that starts with the ontological origin. The formless is forming. It comes into relationship with itself. That's happening outside time. It's forming the ontological basement, logos and chaos. That's giving rise to a quantum realm of probability. That will lead to time and matter and space. And then we're going to get life, psyche, the whole ecosystem of psyche, the imaginos, and God. So I think it's time for another jump in topic now. I want to, in the next chapter, have a look at a very common idea that's found throughout the world, and that's the idea of reincarnation or transmigration. Seems like a strange idea often. Is there a way it could make sense today?